chapter 9, beginning at verse 8, and we pick up the story of Noah after the great flood. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Friends, it's true. I have a problem with rainbows, and that's kind of sad. But I can explain. Now, it's not that I do not appreciate their beauty. I'm one of the first ones to go outside after a storm if the sun is out to see if I can find one in the sky. And likewise, it's not that I don't appreciate what the rainbow represents, that promise. I believe that rainbows are a wonderful sign that reminds us of God's promise to never again destroy all living creatures with a flood. My problem with rainbows, you see, is with their timing. Why did God assign such a reassuring promise of his providential care to an event that usually takes place after the storm has already passed? I mean, rainbows typically occur after the storm has already let up and the clouds have parted to let the sun through. By that time, we already know that the storm is clearing, that the danger is no longer present. What we really need is assurance that God remembers us and remembers his covenant with all living creatures before the storm begins, not after the danger has already passed. Think about it. We are often at our lowest when the storm first breaks, when we hear the news of cancer, when a loved one is first estranged, when the bad news first bursts into our lives. This is when we need the assurance of the rainbow, the promise of the covenant, the sign that God will never again allow the floods to overwhelm us and sweep us away. Again, a rainbow that appears after a storm has passed is a wonderful reminder to show gratitude, our gratitude for God's providential care. But a rainbow that comes before the clouds block out the sun, a sign that reminds us of God's promise before the shadow of the cross darkens our lives, is a blessing indeed. The good news is that we have been given just such a sign given to all the world. And that sign is the church. The church is the light of the world, the sign that God does not seek to destroy us because of our sin, but seeks us out to save us from it. We can be that light of hope to all who suddenly face the darkening clouds of a coming storm. Not because we throw platitudes at those who face gathering clouds, but because the church offers them the hospitality of Jesus Christ. Friends, this is the first challenge that we face during Lent. Just as God set a bow in the clouds to assure humanity that he would remember the promise, God has sent the church into the midst of the world to remind humanity that his promise is to all of creation. So even amid the storms, as the storm clouds gather over our own lives, the church does not turn its back on the rest of God's creation. We share the promises of God's providential care with all living creatures. Yet such a proposition is easier to say than to carry out. The truth is that Lent can all too easily become a time when the church is consumed by its own problems and our own journeys of faith. Still, in the same way that Christ calls the church to reach out to others who suffer as he reached out even from the cross, the rainbow calls on the church to share the same concern and offer the same hope to all of God's creation. God is with us. So how? How can the church be such a sign of hope to all of God's creation? Well, when a friend faces trouble and the storm clouds gather, you listen to them or even raise your concerns to them if they seem to be avoiding the truth. And so too, as friends of God's creation, we listen to and raise environmental concerns. After all, we are part of a larger ecosystem, and God has given us the role of stewards of all his creation, from Adam and Eve, who tended the Garden of Eden, to Noah, whom God called to save all species from the flood. In other words, as I love to say, since the time of Noah, God has charged humanity to be stewards of biodiversity. We've heard it here first. Never forget that. Now, this is not to say that extinction is not part of God's created order. All species have a lifespan dependent upon numerous factors, just like an individual animal has such factors. The environmental concern that we face today is that human activity, including the deliberate, sinful exploitation of God's creation, is prematurely driving some species to and beyond the brink of extinction. It's the difference between a person who dies in her sleep after a long and full life and a young, vibrant adult cut down in the middle of his life by the sinful acts of others. The first situation is accepted as natural, but the second is considered murder and demands intervention. The premature extinction of animals because of selfish human activity is like the latter situation and demands intervention. The rainbow reminds the church of God's promise to all living creatures, and it is up to the church to communicate that promise to the world before the flood breaks out and call on the leaders of nations to take actions to avert premature extinctions, not only for the sake of honoring God's promise to the species involved, but also for the sake of the larger ecosystem upon which we all depend. Another way that the church can be a sign of hope to all of God's creation is the promotion of sustainable lifestyles. Again, just like our church, the church can all too easily be consumed with our own problems on our own journeys of faith during Lent. It can be consumed with thoughts of our own mortality. Yet Lenten reflections on death are not morbid. Instead, once the church both accepts its mortality and the goodness of God's creation, we are free to enjoy life and extend God's hospitality to all living creatures. This hospitality takes concrete shape when the church embodies sustainable lifestyles. from the familiar call to reduce, reuse, and recycle to the call to repent of selfish behaviors and instead be a caretaker of God's creation. The church doesn't have to walk the Lenten journey with blinders on, as if environmental concerns of the world were some kind of distraction. Instead, the church can seek reconciliation with God's creation with the same commitment as it seeks reconciliation with God and one another through Jesus Christ. Friends, God has set the church in the midst of the world as he has set his rainbow in the sky to proclaim his providential care to all living creatures. This promise not only gives us hope when bad news first bursts into our lives, but it also gives the church the specific task to articulate that promise to the world. The safe thing to do, of course, is to wait and see when it is obvious that the storm clouds have indeed passed without destroying all in its path before we act. Then the church can shine like a rainbow that inspires gratitude for God's providential care. I, however, believe that the church can be more than an afterthought, more than a reminder to be grateful to God for God's providential care. I believe that the church can act now even as the storm clouds gather. For I know how much I need a sign of God's promise to all living creatures before the storm breaks. And I believe that the church is called to believe that God will make good on that promise. Again, I'm not suggesting that we throw platitudes about God's promises to the environmental problems that we face, but that we take and call for action. For Noah was not told to sit idly by while God saved creation. Instead, God called on Noah to use all of his human ingenuity to rescue God's creatures from the flood that was caused, after all, by human sin. So as the church begins another season of Lent, let us refuse to put on blinders and only worry about our own individual lives and mortality. Instead, let the church boldly proclaim God's covenant with all living creatures. Let the church affirm our call to act as stewards of God's creation who demand intervention into sinful human activities that threaten our environment and who promote sustainable lifestyles. Let the church be a rainbow, a sign of God's providential care that comes before the storm and affirms God's care for all of God's creation in word and in deed. Let all God's people say,